the Year of the Bible podcast, brought to you by Belle Aire Baptist Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Welcome to the Belle Aire Baptist Church's Year of the Bible podcast. I'm Steve Hiller, along with Pastor Grant Gaines. And Grant, as we wrapped up last week's reading, we were introduced to a character that we continue to read about this week, and that is Hezekiah, one of the kings of the southern kingdom. As we look at Hezekiah's life and as we look at the way that he led the southern kingdom of Judah there, anything that kind of stands out to you about him?
Yeah, well, in 2 Kings 18 and 19, the last two chapters of last week's readings, we are introduced to Hezekiah. And the chapter before that, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Well, the Assyrians then turn their attention to the southern kingdom. The difference is there's a godly king on the throne. And so Hezekiah, in fact, it says in chapter 18, verse 5, that he trusted in the Lord so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah. So he was a very godly man. He removed the high places and idols. And so when Assyria turns their attention to the southern kingdom of Judah, Hezekiah prays, "O Lord our God, save us, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone." And God does save them. And the angel of the Lord miraculously strikes down 185,000 Assyrians. And rather than going into exile right after the northern kingdom, they're saved for 100 and plus years. And then later they do go into exile. But that's where last week's readings left off. And so this week picks back up right in the middle there of the life of Hezekiah. And in 2 Kings 20, you have Hezekiah getting sick. He's ill, but he's told he will die, but he prays and asks the Lord to heal him. And it says in verse 5 of 2 Kings 20, "I have heard your prayer, I've seen your tears, behold, I will heal you." Which, isn't that just a beautiful verse, by the way?
It is.
I mean, think about that. We're still told today to pray for people's healing. We're not promised that we'll always be given it. There's someone in my life right now that I love very dearly that I'm praying for their healing, and it's good to know that God hears those prayers, that he sees those tears, and he will heal them. If not in this life, then in the next, and we pray that it's in this life. But God gives Hezekiah 15 more years and confirms it with that kind of miraculous sign of the shadow moving backward on the sundial and all of that. And so Hezekiah, even though he's one of the greatest kings of Judah, he's not perfect. He kind of gets prideful at the end of his life. These folks from Babylon come knocking on his door. They want to visit, and just he thinks that they're showing up just to see his greatness, like the Queen of Sheba did and King Solomon. And so he kind of naively lets them in, gives them a tour of the kingdom. And Isaiah the prophet's like, "What are you doing, Hezekiah? Don't you know that they have come to spy out the land?" And Isaiah tells him in verse 17, "All that is in your house shall be carried to Babylon now." And so that's eventually what happens.
Yeah.
You have another good king that comes up next in chapters 22 and 23, the King Josiah. He has a lot of reforms under his ministry. He rediscovers the book of the law that is found in the temple. He realizes that all the trouble that's come upon the people of God has been because of their sins. And so he says in chapter 22, verse 13, "Great is the wrath of the Lord because our fathers have not obeyed." And he leads national reform, and he leads Judah to recommit to the terms of the covenant, at least during his lifetime. But it doesn't last long, and by the time you get to 2 Kings 24 and 25, Judah is declining, and they too go into exile, just like the northern kingdom did. In chapter 24, verse 20, it says, "Because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence." And so this is now the southern kingdom going into exile. This happens in 586 BC. The tragedy here, this is where the temple is.
Yeah.
So not only are the people carted off in exile to a foreign land, just like the northern kingdom, but now in Judah, in Jerusalem, you've got the temple of God. Remember all the splendor of the temple that Solomon built? And they come in and they destroy it. They take their leaders into exile. They blind the last king of Israel, of Judah, and they take them off. And so that's how Kings ends, with the southern kingdom being sent into exile. And we talked a lot about the exile theme last week, so we don't have to rehash all of that now. But this is them as they leave the temple. This is really significant because who dwells in the temple?
Yeah.
God does.
The God, yep.
After they built the temple and Solomon prays that prayer of dedication, the glory of God fills the temple so the priest can't even stand to minister in it. And he's there in the Holy of Holies. And now they're separated not only from the land, but they're separated from God's house. And they're driven away from God's presence. The presence of God is having to be left behind. This is, I think, one of the reasons that Jesus comes along. And one of the names of Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And the New Testament begins in Matthew chapter 1. You've got Jesus in Matthew 1:23 it's told to Mary that he will be called Emmanuel, God with us. And why is that so significant? Because for hundreds of years now, between the time of the end of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus Christ, the people of God have been in exile, separated from God's presence. But now God has come to be with them again in the person of his son Jesus, bringing the exile to a close. And now, even if whether the temple building is standing or not, Jesus redefines what temple means, and he is the temple, you know, and his church is the temple, and the Holy Spirit is dwelling among us, and the exile is over through Christ.
Well, as you mentioned a moment ago, we get to the end of the book of 2 Kings in our reading this week, and we begin Chronicles.
And then we start the history all over again.
Right? The history and genealogies.
That's right.
I mean, it felt like chapter after chapter after chapter of genealogies. But is there a reason you think that God has us, in a sense, go through these two different books, these accounts? Is there a different lens, different way we're supposed to think about this?
Well, that's got to be the question on many people's minds. You know, didn't we just read all these things and all these stories? And you did. But everybody knows that historical facts are completely objective. The way you tell the story can be somewhat subjective. Everybody tells the story differently and for different reasons and to different audiences. And the author of Kings and the author of Chronicles are telling the same history, but they're telling it differently. And they're not mixing up the facts or telling contradictory things, but they're emphasizing certain things over other things, so that the audience, it's good for the audience that they have. Now, so when we think about the difference between Kings and Chronicles, there's a few things to consider. First, and maybe most importantly, is the historical setting of Kings versus the historical setting of Chronicles. The book of Kings was written during or just after the exile. And so this is while Israel is in that downward spiral. That's when Kings is being written. As they're being sent off into exile, that's where it's being written in terms of Israel's history. And so the reason Kings is written is to explain why, by the time you get to the end of the book of Kings, everybody's going into exile. And so all throughout Kings, you see highlighted the sin of God's people, the sin of the kings, because they want to explain why it is Israel's going into exile, right? So that's the purpose of Kings. Chronicles is not written during the exile. Chronicles is more than likely written as the people of God are starting to return to the land under Ezra and Nehemiah. So you got two different groups of people that are the audience. The first group is being carted off to Assyria and Babylon. They need to be reminded why. The second group is starting to come back to the promised land and rebuild. They need to be reminded what God can do to build a kingdom. And so all through Chronicles, it's not as if the author of Chronicles doesn't believe Israel did anything wrong or sinned, but their sin is emphasized less in Chronicles than it is in Kings. Just to give you, an example, when Chronicles talks about David, it shows mainly the strengths of David and Solomon and doesn't often mention their failures. And so there's no mention, for example, of Bathsheba in the book of Chronicles. Why? Because it's not that didn't happen. It's that this is written for a people that need to know if we're faithful, if we're righteous, what can God do for us as we try to rebuild? And so it highlights kind of the high points, the positive of things that Israel got right. in their history because they needed to be encouraged that God can still do those things today. So that's kind of one of the main differences. You have this first 9 chapters of our Chronicles reading is just genealogies.
A lot of names.
A lot of genealogies. Why is that? Well, because Chronicles wants to show that God was not done with the story, and it's tying this generation of Israelites that are returning to the Promised Land to rebuild. They are being tied through this long family tree to the same people that left, to people like David and Solomon and Elijah and Elisha, to the good folks, and those are also their forefathers. And so it's trying to show that this is just the next generation of God's people, and that what God did back then, God can do again. So that's what the author of Chronicles is trying to do. There's a lot of emphasis in Chronicles on the temple, and there's a lot of emphasis in Chronicles on the priesthood. There are multiple chapters about the priests and their function. Why? Even things that aren't mentioned in Kings are mentioned here about temple and priesthood. Why? Because when they get back, they're having to rebuild the temple. They're having to reestablish the priesthood. Yeah. And so they need recent examples of what that is supposed to look like. And so that's one of the purposes of Chronicles.
A lot as we get into the wrapping up of Kings and into Chronicles, and I appreciate helping us kind of think through the different maybe lens and perspective of why those two books are different. But as we do in just basically every podcast and about every sermon you preach, we look for Jesus in what we read. And so as we look at the genealogies, as we look at the emphasis on the priesthood, as we see Chronicles talking about what different people in the nation of Israel were to be doing upon the return, where do we see Jesus in that? What does that mean for us today?
Well, I think Chronicles is trying to communicate to the people of God, God's not done. What he did in the past, he can do for this new generation that's returning to the Promised Land. God's not done. He's the God, same God yesterday, today, and forever. This is just the next installment of that truth for that generation. The way to understand the way Jesus fulfills this and the way it applies to us is to understand the rest of the story. Every generation needs to be reminded God's not done. Yeah. What he did in the past, he can do for us today. The truth is, even though that generation was encouraged by the book of Chronicles in that way, once they got into the Promised Land and started to rebuild, they were only faithful for a little while, and then they went off the rails again. And then for 400 years, you've got prophetic silence in between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. And so when Jesus is born and the Son of God comes and dwells among us, then you really have God saying to another generation, in a more ultimate way through his Son, God's not done. And the same God of David and Solomon, the same God of Ezra and Nehemiah as they try to rebuild, is now here in a more permanent and ultimate way through Jesus Christ. And the rebuilding that they were hopeful about, in returning to the Promised Land in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, the Chronicles was encouraging. That rebuilding may have failed then, but Christ has come to rebuild in a way that will be permanent and lasting. The temple, the worship, all of those things will be reestablished permanently under Christ. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and we know that he's at work among us and can be encouraged by that same truth.
Well, there's a lot that we did not get to in this brief conversation here in this week's podcast, but I hope that you will really dig in as you read the end of Kings and get into Chronicles this week. If you ever have a question about something that you're reading, feel free to email that into us. Maybe on a future podcast episode, we'll be tackling some of those questions that might come in. You can send that to info@belleirebc.com. Again, that's info@belleirebc.com. And if you want more information about this Year of the Bible podcast, as well as some tools to help you stay on track, to encourage you in your reading, then visit our website. It's belleirebc.com/Bible. That's belleirebc.com/Bible. For Pastor Grant Gaines, I'm Steve Hiller. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope you'll like and subscribe on whatever podcast platform you've connected on us with, and that you'll join us again next week.
Thank you for listening to the Year of the Bible podcast. For more information about Belle Aire Baptist Church, go to belleirebc.com.